Good morning, everybody, and a very, very warm welcome. I'm just going to be giving an opportunity for a few more people to join, so people are still joining in. We do have the wonderful privilege of having load shedding, so this has disrupted things, but we will not let this put us off. So I'm just letting everybody get in who maybe is starting up, having some internet issues. So if you wouldn't mind, while we're waiting to get started, just pop a message in and let us know where you're connecting from so that we can comment and welcome you. As we just continue to let people join in. Good morning, Christoph. Right, so we've got Michelle from Bloberg in Cape Town. Yes, Mary Gentile has joined us all the way from the USA. We're giving her a special shout out because I think it's 3 o'clock in the morning. She's one of our speakers this morning. Jim is joining us all the way from Scotland. So Jim, it is great to have you joining us. Marcus is joining us from Windhoek in Namibia. It's a Veleni from Namibia. This is great. Precious from Johannesburg. Gordon from Cape Town. Miri from Namibia. It's so fantastic to see everybody connecting in. Thank you. We are going to get started in the next few minutes, or actually within the next minute. Just letting everybody, fantastic. Bushan from Mauritius. Nice to have you on here. Joburg, Germany. I'm just going to shout out some of the countries. Germany, Cape Town, Sweden, Namibia, Mauritius, Gaborone, Mauritius, London. I must say, I'm quite convinced this is the most international of our series so far. So it is fantastic to see you all joining us this morning. Joburg, Namibia. Hi, Christelle. So Christelle is from the Alumni Association, and she's joining us as well. So thank you for joining us. Zambia, fantastic. So keep those messages popping in. All right, I'm going to just pull up something here on my side. All right, so let's get started. Good morning, everyone. My name is Laura Kirsten, and I'm a part of the marketing team at USB Executive Development. USB Ed is the short course arm of the business school. So on behalf of USB Ed and the USB Alumni Association, welcome to the 4th and final webinar in our Conscious Leadership series for 2021. We were going to go out with a bang this year. I'm pleased to see guests, as we've just read out, from across the continent and from all over the world, it seems, today. And we see some familiar names from our previous webinars. And then also, of course, an especially warm welcome to some of our clients, and more specifically our in-country partners who are joining us today. For those of you who are new to the series, I'd like to just briefly explain what we mean when we speak of conscious leadership and how this series actually came about. So a conscious leader considers the whole person in their leadership style. And by this, I mean all facets, so both personally and professionally. COVID-19 has meant that these facets of ourselves are continuously and often visibly overlapping, intertwining, and sometimes even butting heads and needing to be managed. And this is simply life. Now, business must account for this shift in their models, in their capacity, and in their processes in order to maintain an engaged workforce and a supportive company culture. So with the theme of conscious leadership in mind, the 4 webinar topics for this series were conceptualized based on feedback from clients, from you, in terms of specific challenges that they're dealing with. And most of us, I'm certain, can actually relate to today's title. So just to recap what that is, it's the straight and narrow of ethical leadership. How conscious leaders create the most value for society while still maintaining their moral values. So at a time when so many businesses are struggling to stay open, struggling to innovate fast enough, where leaders are struggling to retain, motivate, and support their staff, where they're under pressure to do so much more with less. Ethical and responsible leadership simply has to be the foundation of sustainable growth and recovery. So we would like you to keep on popping your questions. So you're welcome to pop questions through on the chat because we're going to be keeping an eye on those. And if necessary, I will interrupt. I will interrupt the team and pop your questions in. And if we're able to unmute you, then we'll give you an opportunity to ask the question yourself. But please do keep your questions coming throughout. So I'm honored and very excited to hand over to Professor Arnold Smit. He's the Associate Professor of Business and Society at the University of Stellenbosch Business School, and he will be steering our conversation today. We're very privileged in that Arnold has ethical friends in high and far-flung places, including Professor Mary Gentile, joining us from Virginia in the US, Eddy Jolicoeur from Mauritius, and finally, Professor Kurt April, also based in Cape Town. So incidentally, it's, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, it's 3:30 in the morning in Virginia. So an extra special thank you to Mary for starting her day particularly early. In the interest of time, I'm not going to spend time introducing each of our speakers specifically, as you would have had an opportunity in the slides, and no doubt what they do will actually come through in the conversation. So that's it for me now. Over to you, Arnold, and thank you again.
I guess I'm unmuted. Yes, I just saw that. So welcome, welcome to everybody. Thank you, Laura. Also, I would like to join you in welcoming all the participants, so from all over the world. I guess the secret to that is because of the following that Mary and Kurt and Eddy actually have. So that's the reason why I think that we've got this wonderful crowd this morning together, and also expecting some more. Can I also add, you've raised the issue of load shedding. I have to warn that I'm quite used to losing the signal when there's the switch between systems at my house. So it might be that round about 10, I will disappear. Keep the conversation going, panelists, keep it going. I will be back, so don't worry about that. And I think you will have enough to say, you don't need me in order to keep the conversation rolling. So I just need to warn you. So just to highlight, I saw that somebody raised the expectation and saying that I would like to get some great tips. So in other words, we do have an empowering conversation in mind. So we do have a conversation in mind in which we are not just going to focus on the problematic side of what we are talking about, but also on the development side, the strengthening side, building confidence, taking into account that we are dealing in our audience with real people, with real challenges, but also with potential to make a difference. And this is where we would like to move towards in our conversation. So just to add then, whilst Laura already did the welcoming, in that sense, we have Professor Mary Gentile, Mary as a world authority on values-driven leadership. And we would like to find out more about that. Professor Kurt April is an expert on leadership, diversity, and inclusion, and what can be more real and relevant as of this moment in the world and also in South Africa in particular. And then Eddy Jolicoeur from Mauritius as a seasoned business leader, having lots of corporate experience, and as well at the same time, a campaigner, a social campaigner for important social issues, amongst that also gender. So if I can kick off and also say to the audience, we have agreed on a free-flowing conversation of which we would like you as audience to not just be the audience, but also to become active participants in, and don't allow us too much free flow before you interrupt us and become part of what we try to do here. Colleagues, I would like to start off with an observation, and that is that we seem to be living in a world that's much more sensitive to ethics and values at the moment. There seems to be a need manifested in many areas, communities, households, organizations, even nations. Is this your observation too? And why would that be the case? How would we understand this almost demand for ethical guidance? I'm going to start from east to west, and Eddy, maybe to start off with you. How would you interpret this increasing sensitivity around ethics and values at the moment? You are muted, Eddy.
Thank you, Arnold, for the introduction.
There you go.
And for the invitation. Indeed, I mean, you asked a question about whether we are more sensitive to values. That's a tough one. But what is true is that we are in a transparency tyranny. Everything is just being spread all over. Everything is being revealed. And in that transparent, social-driven world, we as senior executives, especially those with rather high profile, seem to be constantly tested and called to task, over ethics and morals in how to do business or in how to eventually live our lives. So that's what I feel, and I borrowed that transparency tyranny from somebody who is a known futurist, and he shared that with me. But I quite agree with that,
I would like to also then take this to Kurt. I mean, I said I'm going to get us started off by moving from east to west, Kurt. So we're south now. But would you like to expand on what Eddy has said, and maybe also tell us something about your classroom experiences, because you're a seasoned lecturer across many areas, and specifically where you work at the University of Cape Town. What's your experience around this in your conversations?
So I'll add on, thanks Arnold, I'll add on what Eddy mentioned, this shift in ethical expectations in the world. I mean, the world changes, and there's been a complete shift in what the public, what citizens, what employees require from an ethical position, stance, from the employers, from the governments, and from their workplaces. We see the shift in business going from, businesses who were beholden to shareholders before, and was taken as a norm. If you go back and you look at old economics books, I mean, this is how we were taught in business schools, in management colleges, in universities, and so on. And there's been a complete shift to moving from shareholders to looking at stakeholders. But we're now moving towards what's known as focal stakeholders. We don't just do things broadly, but how do we focus in on particular issues, social injustices, service delivery problems? How do we focus in on that? So we're talking about focal stakeholders, while at the same time, we're starting to look at ethical requirements across our entire supply chain. So that'd be periphery stakeholders, if you like. So issues that come into it is, yes, I'm very happy to get my strawberries all year round, but is it ethical that we have planes fly in every day from around the world so that I can eat strawberries in my local town every day? Whereas, it used to be seasonal before, but now I can have it every day. Is that an ethical decision? So we look at the whole supply chain around those things. We look at what's the impact of those planes flying around on the environment. Is it right that, we're putting CO2 into the environment and so on? And we know the environmental issues right now on everybody's mind globally. We look at what does it mean in terms of, in the old days, we used to require governments to provide all the services we need, schools and roads and so on. but is there an ethical requirement from business to step in? And maybe, I mean, if you just look at our country down in the southern tip of Africa, the government has got 1,001 things on its plate. It's not getting to all of those. Should some of our private companies who are making billions a year step in and build schools and even run schools? Is that a moral obligation? And then we see the shift of privacy, right? We've seen recently Facebook being called up, Instagram being called up, and so on around the world. The people expect their privacy to be safeguarded. People have expectations of what's allowed and what's not allowed. What can we? So it's this tension between our freedom of choice, but also what serves the common good. We see this also with vaccine efficacy. Freedom of choice versus what works for the common good, the social good. And finally, I would say the issue of changing demography in organizations, you know, how things used to be, who became employees, who became managers and leaders is changing around the world. We see populations changing, people who are coming into our organization are different. They don't all go to the usual schools, the usual universities. They come from what's known as atypical backgrounds. They might come from rural backgrounds, lower socioeconomic group, being schooled in community colleges, not Ivy League universities, and so on. How do we have a moral obligation to engage with them as credibly as we did with private school, Ivy League employees who were on a track towards management and leadership? So for me, those, you know, I could go on and on, Arnold, but those for me are the fundamental shifts I see happening around ethical expectations from the public. And this has been played out whether we're at university or in the workplace and so on. Thanks.
Well, I think it's a fascinating sequence in terms of which the conversation is developing. Eddy, that spoke about transparency tyranny, and you kind of explored the new stakeholder environment around that and the shifts taking place in that. Mary, I think you are quite known for almost a conversion that you have gone through, that there are no straightforward right, wrong answers, in the sense that you cannot just paint an answer onto these questions, and that stock standard answers kind of disappointed even yourself at some point in time. And you started to ask different questions about the way in which people and leaders in particular actually can go about that. Would you like to share more about this also in response to what Eddy and Kurt just shared?
Sure. Thanks so much, Arnold. And it's an honor to be here with the three of you. So you asked in the beginning, you know, why are companies more receptive to ethics and values? And I guess the way I think about that is it's kind of the best of times and the worst of times. I think that the receptivity, you know, I resonate with what Eddy said about transparency tyranny. I think that the visibility and the high stakes of certain issues that we've been dealing with in recent years, you know, I'm thinking about climate change, I'm thinking about COVID, I'm thinking about inequality, the visibility and the high stakes of those things. And then the inequality has made even more visible the interconnectedness of all these issues and how they affect all of us. And then we get to what Kurt was talking about in terms of our greater access to and the speed of communication about these issues. And I think all of those things together have sort of raised the profile. They've also given us the opportunity to emphasize employee voice and wider voice, which I think is something that Kurt was starting to get to. And that's really where my work comes in. You know, my focus, as you said, is shifting the question from what is the right thing to do to how do you get the right thing done? I mean, obviously there are times when the right thing is not always that clear, but there are a lot of times when most of us actually have a sense of a direction that makes sense, but we're not sure it's feasible or possible to act on it. And so I think that it's the best of times and worst of times in the sense that we have an opening in terms of urgency, kind of the burning platform. We have greater visibility, greater possibilities for connection and communication around these issues. It's the worst of times in the sense that the stakes are so high that we have to get this right, and we don't have an endless timeline.
Can I stay with you for a while? And because of your work on giving voice to values, I think we also need to help our audience somewhat with clarification around terminology, ethics and values. What do we mean by saying these things? Not necessarily a clear-cut definition, but how are they different? But also, how do they hang together? Would you like to speak more about that?
Sure, thanks, Arnold. Yeah, these are both words that are overdetermined, that people interpret them in many different ways, but I'll give you the sense of how I view them in a way that I think helps people work toward action, which is that I tend to think of ethics as a set of norms, a set of guidelines, a set of rules, if you wish, that are typically externally based, so you have a code of ethics for your profession, whether you're a lawyer or a business person or a doctor or a nurse. There's codes of ethics. Your companies have a code of ethics, typically. These are rule-based ideas. And then also from the fields of philosophy, there are ethical guidelines and questions that we would typically use in order to determine what's right. Values, I think of something as more aspirational, as more coming from within. I'm thinking of this in terms of the research that's been done about across culture, across time, about a core set of values, the philosopher called them hypernorms, that tend to be universally shared despite cultural differences and historical differences. And it's a short list, it's a high level list, but it is a fairly universal list. And so, really high level things like integrity and compassion and respect. And so what I think about, the reason I tend to focus on giving voice to values rather than giving voice to ethics is because I'm trying to tap into the motivation, the aspiration that comes from within, the kind of person and the kind of world that we would like to be and like to live in. And I think that helps with getting people engaged in these issues rather than seeing ethics as a set of constraints on action, which is usually not that appealing to, particularly to business people, who are motivated by building enterprises and building wealth and coming up with great products and services. Rather, I tend to think of values as more can-do, more entrepreneurial, if you will, to tap into that energy.
Yeah. And yet, in many of my conversations, and maybe Eddy, back to yourself as a business person, Kurt, you have also spoken quite a lot about diversity and shifts that take place. In many of my conversations, people almost come up and saying, but people are coming from so many different places, so many different backgrounds, have been shaped by so many different cultural, religious, and other experiences, that they almost find it impossible to find common ground. So the excuse that I quite often hear for moving into a space where we can start having a useful conversation about what we agree upon is being troubled by this idea of diversity, of value systems, beliefs, and where people might be coming from, and so I would like to hear the panel's response on that in terms of this state of confusion and finding common ground and how to actually make progress in that sense. Kurt.
Yeah, Arnold, I would add in one more thing, which I think clarifies it for me. For me, I like to make a distinction, as Mary spoke about ethics as being a sort of set of rules which governs our behavior. In shorthand, we often say what's right and wrong. Values for me is very different, right? It's a belief that is quite individual, that has an enduring preference for us. So values for me are changeable. What I value now could change over time. It's my preference to some enduring belief I have. Now, I make a distinction between principles and values. For me, the stuff Mary mentioned, like integrity and respect, these are universal principles for me across the globe. Integrity is integrity. How we enact integrity is different depending on the region we're in, the culture, the religion, and so on. Respect is a principle for me. Respect across the world is a respect. How we enact respect differs depending on where you are in the globe, region, and so on. But values for me is very different. Values is my belief for an enduring preference for something, right? So if I say to you, what are my top 3 values right now in my life? I could list them for you, but in 5 years' time, the top 3 might have shifted, and what was 2 become 5, and so on in my own life. So as our life and our own personal life cycle moves on and evolves, I think our values change and evolve. Principles don't change for me. They stay there forever. And so when I discuss this with organizations, I like to make this distinction. Organizations love to put up sort of values. You walk into companies, they got the 6 A3 sheets on their wall of the different values. But when you actually talk to the people, you'll see there's no real commonality of values. They all agree we have to work in ways that are good and socially acceptable principles for me. But the values, when I actually do it, and I actually have sort of values questionnaires for organizations, I have never seen 2 people mark the same 2 values in my life, and I've done this around the globe. So I think our values are different, but we agree to sign up to some sort of principles. Now, I know that's a silly distinction. We can put it into one bag, but how do we prefer to act that serves the common good, I think, is a better way to describe it.
Yeah, I mean, that's a fascinating conversation, because I work quite a lot with the 5 common values that Mary highlight: honesty, respect, responsibility, fairness, and compassion. And then on the other hand, there's also this element of individuality versus commonality. I have a sense of saying those 5 values don't belong to me. They belong to the world. They belong to humanity. You can only recognize them in relationships. There is nothing so exclusively individual about them that I can own up to them without having to face somebody else in terms of how we do them, how we make them work, how we make them principled, let's say, and embedded in relational and cooperative context. But exactly, Eddy, the point that Kurt left us with, I would like to pick up with you now. Because people sometimes experience companies as being insincere. Yes, you walk in at the front door, you see the values, and this is where I would like also to say a mix of strategic, operational, and principled or moral values, all collated together in a list. And they sit there for all to see. I mean, I was, this morning, I took a PCR test because I need to go to Namibia over the weekend. And I walked into an organization, a pharmaceutical organization, a laboratory, doing these tests. And it was once again this mix of things all smacked together. How do we go about this, Eddy? How can companies go about making their values authentic, real, and that you can actually find integrity in the way in which it's being lived? What is the executive responsibility around that? What might be the employee case around it?
Okay. No, I would like to come back to what Kurt mentioned earlier in terms of principles and values. In fact, I am not into semantics and sort of nuances in terms of definition. What is more important for me is what you mentioned, Arnold, is how do you get the people to live the values? Values can be spelt out. And indeed, I think Kurt rightly mentioned that in annual reports and in organizations' lobbies and so on, you do have nice pictures talking about values and so on. But the more important thing is how do those people now live the values? How do they express and behave according to the values? For me, it's what I'm worried about is that is this superficiality of how we describe things today, and we're skimming, a lot of superficial ideas and influences on the surface, and we become then like experts of some sort of superficial knowledge, and that pollutes the organization in its proper functioning. Now, for me, the question of values, whether values are universal, I agree, there are some universal values, but is it a real right or wrong thing? Now you put culture, religion, and all that in the equation, it complicates the thing. For me, maybe we should use the term appropriate. What would be appropriate for our environment larger than business? Because we are also talking about within and outside the business. What would be an appropriate conduct and behavior for executives? And how do you then get that appropriate behavior to be lived in your organization? I think we have methods of measuring, we have methods of monitoring, but it's more about getting people to embrace and to own, the values in such a way that more than a behavior, it would become a reflex somehow.
And maybe the question is, how do we get that right? So good. Can I just say, Mary has dropped off the call. I hope that I will not be the next one to go. However, the two of you will then have to keep going. Good. Yes, you're welcome.
Yeah, I want to build on what Eddy's saying, about
yes.
what is appropriate, and I do think what he's talking to is this action to intention. There's so many fora and meetings that talk to, I pledge to do this. I have a vision to do that. I'm committed to do that. But we don't see the intention turning to action. And so, as Eddy says, what is appropriate? I think for me, it starts with who we think we are as people in organizations, that we can behave in certain ways. We need to ask ourselves the question, what gives us the right to behave towards another person in the way that we do? To women, we still got, gender-based violence. Men think that they have the right to determine the roles and the places handed to women. We continue to mistreat them. We think we own women, that we can buy women. The media perpetuates, for instance, this notion of women as objects. I don't know how in 2021 some leaders sat around a boardroom and okayed an advert for a car, for a house, to have a woman, scantily dressed, lying across a car and so on. What gives us the right as leaders of organization to perpetuate notions, and I'm just using the example of women here, as women as objects? We continue and we determine as men what women can do with their bodies and minds. And so for me, when we say what is appropriate, I would love us to move away from intention, because I often think the values conversations, the ethical conversations, tend to stay stuck in good intentions, and we debate definitions. And I agree with Eddy, we get caught up in the definitions of it, as opposed to, if you look at examples right now in this country, for instance, besides the adverts that I see which objectify women, think about where, as leaders of organizations, managers who took decisions to put, for instance, alcohol outlets in suburbs and in regions of this country where we know there's alcohol fetal syndrome, where we know there's alcohol-induced abuse, violence, law dismissal, crimes related to alcohol. How about those same leaders say, can we not put outlets in those neighborhoods where we could have healthier drinks that still makes money for us, but we actually bring healthier lifestyles into the societies? If you look at where cheap food, unhealthy fast food is normally placed, those outlets, they're in under-resourced communities. So who sits in boardrooms and purposefully decides to target segments of society, and we convince ourselves that people actually want this? For me, it reminds me of the old DOP system in South Africa. How about we think about placing food outlets in those places, but healthier food in those outlets, but at a cheaper price? Those are the kind of, for me, when you ask about an ethical responsibility, those are for me the ethical decisions around justice and care. We say we support as organizations when we had the Me Too movement. Everybody came out, organizations made statements, but still we allow certain jokes to be okay in the workplace. How is that action to our intention? And for me, that's where the conversation around values falls short. I would love to see leaders take actual practical steps to engage the social ills in societies through appropriate action. And that's, for me, the disconnect. We can have wonderful values posters on our walls, but if we're still perpetuating the ills going forward for the majority of societies around the world, then they are just nice to have.
Thanks, Kurt.
No.
Arnold has dropped off, as he said he might. I'm sure he'll be back on shortly. There's a couple of questions that have come through, so maybe we could just field some of those questions while we wait for Arnold to join us back. I know that Itavaleni has his hand up, so I'm actually going to, Itavaleni, you can ask your question if you'd like. You can unmute.
Thank you, Laura. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Well, yeah, thank you. This is a topic that is very close to my heart, seeing the issues that we experiencing in contemporary society. So my question goes like this, and I hope I'm clear to my audience. So how do cultural, tribal values, etc., and norms impact corporate, institutional values, norms, etc.? And I see a contrast, like a clash of values, norms, and principles scenario. Where do we draw the line? Because these things drive each other. Just to bring it out more clearly, an individual comes from a certain cultural setup where certain norms and values are embedded in him. And I'm sure that 60 to 70% of the world population, I'm just making an example, works. And then when they go to a workplace where they spend 70% of their time, they are supposed to go along with the corporate ethics and values. And I think there's sometimes a clash. And someone mentioned the issue of pretending. Some people just go and put on a show because this is what puts bread on the table, or this is what drives their passion. But people don't easily compromise their cultural principles and values. And how do corporations come into accepting people's cultural norms and values? Where do we draw the line? Because this is what is defining society nowadays.
So I'll chime in if that makes sense. I think that's a hugely important question. And we're all sort of working to find the answers to those questions, but I can tell you a bit about my experience when I share the ideas that I talk about with giving voice to values cross-culturally. I remember when I first started developing this approach that I work on, A lot of folks in the US and in Western Europe said to me, Mary, this is an interesting approach to developing, values-driven action, ethical action in our organizations. And it might work here, meaning in the US or Western Europe, but it's not going to work in, and then they would fill in the blank. Some of them would say it won't work in Asia, it won't work in South America, it won't work in Africa, it won't work in Russia or the Middle East. And I thought, well, they may be right. I'm Mary Gentile from Boston. Maybe it doesn't. But I started getting invited to those places, and I started sharing it in those places, and I found a great receptivity to these ideas in those places. But I had to do a few things in order to make it translate, and I think some of these issues can be helpful in organizations. So the first thing I had to do was to acknowledge the reality of the context I was in. So I couldn't pretend that the experiences, and in particular the pressures, were the same in one place versus another. And so, the first thing I would have to do is inform myself about what was going on in those areas, in those cultures, in those regions, in those industries sometimes, and acknowledge that reality. And the second thing I had to do was start from a position of respect, where I would say, look, I'm not Mary Gentile coming to you from Boston to tell you what your values should be. I know you have values, but I also know, given the context that we just acknowledge, that it's not always easy to act on those values. And so you start from that position of respect. And I said, and what I'm trying to do is to maybe help you develop some strategies to do so more effectively, to act on your values more effectively. So people saw this more as a problem-solving approach that respected them, as opposed to my coming in and telling them what they can or cannot do. And the third thing I had to do was to explain what I call the giving voice to values thought experiment, where I would say, look, I'm going to share some scenarios that I know are relevant in your context. And I'm not going to say what's the right thing to do. I'm going to share a scenario where there's an individual, a protagonist in the scenario, who knows what they believe is right, but isn't sure how to accomplish it in the context where they're operating. And what I'm going to ask you to do, I'm not going to ask you, what would you do? Because that triggers all kinds of defensiveness and psychological processes that limit our creativity. But rather, I'm going to ask you, how could this person be successful? And so that actually opens up the space. It's more of a laboratory for implementation conversations. It brings the stress down and it gets people more engaged. And the fourth thing I do is I always try and have an example, as much as I can, from the context, the culture, the region, the industry, the faith tradition, whatever it is, of someone who has accomplished what we're talking about. And what that does is it both signals a sense that this is possible, a sense of pride, but also a sense of competitiveness. If they can do it, why can't I do it? And the fifth and final thing I try and do is I explain that the voice in giving voice to values is a metaphor. It doesn't mean going to your boss, your manager, your colleagues, your customer and saying, you're wrong and, I know what's right. It rather means thinking of a lot of different ways to communicate that those individuals might be able to hear. It might be asking questions. It might be talking to someone who will talk to someone who talks to the decision maker. That seems to be really useful when I'm working in very high hierarchy type contexts. It might mean, simply gathering some data that wasn't part of the situation, part of the decision before, and sharing that in a broad way. So once I start sharing those things, people start to get engaged in a different way. And the last thing I'll say about that around cultural difference is I know we talked earlier about this sort of high level of values that are widely shared. Kurt calls them principles, and I think that's a great way to distinguish them. The thing is that I also talk to people about, when you encounter a values conflict, try and figure out, does this rise to the level of one of those high level values, one of those principles? Or is this more a matter of preference where we might agree to disagree? If it rises to the level of one of those high level values where you really do need to address it, then it becomes important to think about, how can I speak about it in a way that will appeal to the value that we're likely to share, rather than using strictly the language, the norms, the guidelines, the vocabulary that's unique to my culture, to my faith, to my context. How can I speak about this in a way that will resonate with what where that person is coming from. So those are some of the ways that I try and address this issue. And finally, I'll just say, and I tend to focus on these issues as implementation challenges, rather than on seeing them as only values conflicts. And that gets people engaged in problem solving. If we have time later, I'll tell you a great story about doing that when I was teaching at Harvard Business School.
I wish I could turn into a panelist, having lost the call. But apart from that, Kurt, I will be with you just now. Laura, I just need to ask you, because of the fact that I've lost the Q&A, dropping off the call wiped out the Q&A on my side as well as the chat. So I've lost that track. So please keep an eye on that, because I want to pick up on something that's in the chat line at the moment, which is about courage. But there was also in the Q&A, there was a reference to power, the role of leaders in terms of their position. Now, what I hear Mary say is that values-driven work is normal business. You have to expect it all across transactions, appointments, operations, price determination, safety issues. It is not a special category of work. It's normal business. And I think the key is how do we integrate it properly? But one of the things, and this is what I would like to drill down a little bit into, and Kurt, I realize that you wanted to say something, but maybe you want to pick up exactly on this point, and Eddy can continue with that, is that one of the things that I often hear in these kind of conversations is that power relations determine quite a lot of what people are willing to do because of the fear of career limiting conversations or moves. In the end, people end up as whistleblowers, extremely damaging to themselves and their relationships. So it's one thing if somebody reports to me and I say, come, we need to have a conversation. It's something different when a colleague of mine steps over the line and I think, this is a bit uncomfortable to have a conversation about values and ethics with somebody so close to me. How do I go about it when it's upstream from me? And I need to address somebody that I report to that's senior, more powerful, and might be the one who sits on the ethical side of the equation. Kurt, maybe you would like to enter into that space.
Yeah, no, thanks, Arnold. I'd like to build on what you said about power and maybe link to Mary's issue about voice and using appropriate and relevant stories in our work, which also ties into the last question, people who have to sacrifice their authenticity to go to work every day. It comes down to whose voice are we listening to? Who has power over who? And that's quite important. It's come through various movements around the world, universities in the US, Europe, Asia, here in Africa. We talk about how do we begin to, and it's an unfortunate term, we talk about decolonizing the mind, right? So who has center stage, whose voice, and who has power? So we ask the question, who is the prototype of a leader in the world? Now, if we had to ask people which leadership books they're reading, right, it tends to be Anglo-American, right? It's Jack Welch, it's Steve Jobs, it's Richard Branson, it's Bill Gates. And so, the question I would drop in is, how many of you can name me 10 strategists from the continent of Africa that you follow? Liberia, the Gambia, Ethiopia. Name me strategists. Name me some work on operational management that you drew from Ghana or Nigeria or Namibia. Very few people can do that. So what we come down to is who holds the power? Who is the prototype of power? Is it if you just took US leaders today of listed companies in America, in the American population, 15% of individuals are over 6 foot tall. But if you look at the men who are CEOs of listed companies in the US, they are 60% of them are male heterosexual, over 6 foot tall. So who is the prototype? And this talks to our previous, I would say, caller in a sense, who asked the question. And he asked, how does he walk into an organization or people like him and show up authentically when the power dynamics, who we're reading, what we're reading, if you think about the case studies we teach Arnold, where are we drawing from? I mean, it's only recently that UCT and Stellenbosch and Wits started writing cases on the African continent. I mean, most universities are in the world. When I teach out in Asia, or we draw on Harvard cases, I mean, they're great cases, but it can't be the only things we draw on. We want to learn from a Harvard, but I also want to learn what is Egypt doing? What is the country of Jordan doing? What is Vietnam doing that is quite interesting? You know, so what, that intellectual space we occupy cause people who are atypical, come from different backgrounds, who look different, who are overweight, who are short, who are gender identified differently from heterosexual or cisgender, that allow them into the space in an authentic way. And that's the ethical responsibility we have as leaders, to create these inclusive workspaces for people to show. So the bigger question we ask is, who has the power and whose voice are we talking to? Because that then sits in whether I consider myself credible, or am I spending all of my time playing catch up to the prototype? So then I'm going to dye my hair and straighten my hair so I look like the prototype. I'm going to use skin whitening products so I look like the prototype. I'm going to speak in an accent so I'm closer to the prototype. I'm going to try and get into the universities that the prototypes go to so that I can join the club, and so on. And all that means in my psychological space is me, authentic me, becomes less and less and less credible. And I'm giving up who I am, I'm giving up my authenticity, and I'm giving up my cultural norms so that I can get ahead socially and economically. And it might be very different when I come home in the evening, because I find a very different me. And so we end up in that place which psychologists call cognitive dissonance, which have massive impacts on self-esteem and self-confidence. I have two realities I can't bring together in a congruent way. So for me, Arnold, the question of power playing a role is enormous. This ethical responsibility of what other streams of power do we allow as leaders to be credible in the organization? How do we uplift those who are marginalized in a way, sponsor them, talk about them, mentor them in a way so that they are equally credible? And we don't set up systems so that I remain the prototype and everybody's playing catch up to be closer to who I am. So for me, that's the dilemma.
Yeah, that points right to your menu and your Eddy, because of your HR background, because of your multiple experiences, because of the multicultural environment in Mauritius where you also function. How would you respond to that? Both the power equation on the one hand, and on the other hand, maybe practical suggestions that you could share with us in terms of what you've done in your career as an executive to create a safe environment where people can come fully into their own, and where there is not a fear to deal with matters of ethics and values, also from the sort that Kurt has just described.
This is quite complex when you take, just to rewind a little bit on Mary's intervention earlier about the cultural problematic when defining what values are. I know it's been a debate for a long time, just like the problematic of the center of power and all this. Bring it back to reality. I would tend to say let us be maybe more pragmatic and think about the morals we were raised with, like, treat others how you would want to be treated. Well, be grateful, say thank you, help those who are struggling. All those are morals that I believe are universal. I mean, it's the question of culture in there or religion maybe are would be quite irrelevant. I think conventions may change, and that's what would make values to shift. I think in the end, do you? Oops. Do we have the guts to stand up for what we believe in and what we fight for in an environment that can be difficult or that can be, retaliating when we dare say a number of things? How do you create the safe environment, as you mentioned, Arnold? Now we are getting into a larger space than the organization. I think creating safe environment, it's a question of not a business organization, but it's a take for the business community in the environment, and not just a few organizations taking initiatives. I think it's more, I would say, of a national call than just a business call. We have to create that that environment where people would be safe to express themselves and to denounce whenever there are things that are unethical that are being done. I don't know. That's what I think. So,
yeah. Well, I think the notion of an overall ecosystem of safety in a society where there is safety, I think at the moment that's perhaps not what we experience. It's perhaps not what we experience in the South African context. So if I can make it perhaps if I can up the problematic in a sense in our conversation here. Maybe the utmost case is the whistleblower case. Now, I do not want us necessarily to go down that alley because of the fact that it has its own complexities. But it's particularly relevant in the South African context at the moment. I think, Kurt, from a university perspective, you had a very real experience in that sense also. In the networks of your own work and operations. Mary, I seem to believe that your approach offers a potential answer to that. So that does not necessarily need to be the ultimate sacrificial deed. If there is an empowering alternative, in terms of what you have referred to also in your previous inputs. Would you like to comment on that maybe? Because I do think that we have people on this call today who might feel that I do find myself in an uncomfortable environment where there is this kind of pressure. And I need to address certain things. But does that have to be the ultimate sacrifice? Right. And with consequences to my own future, to my family, to my safety, and so forth.
Right. It's a great question, Arnold. And it frankly is one of the questions that motivated me in the work that I do, largely because I had seen acting and voicing on your values as something that did require this Herculean level of moral courage, and that it was something that only people who were comfortable with risks and who were more assertive and extroverted could do. And I thought, gee, I don't necessarily see myself that way. Does that mean that I can never voice and act on my values, And so that was one of the motivations. And the other motivation was looking at the research on whistleblowing, as you were just talking about, and how costly that is for the whistleblower, for the victims of whatever action they feel called to blow the whistle upon, for the organizations, for the community at large. And it seemed to me there had to be something before you got to that point. I mean, obviously there are times when blowing the whistle is necessary, lives are at stake or time is short, whatever. But isn't there a way to make that less feasible, less necessary? So instead of simply having to put into place anti-retaliation policies, which is a good thing, that we were actually avoiding having to get there. And so that's really why I wanted to create Giving Voice to Values. And I have to say, in my gathering stories around the world and in my own context of people who encountered values conflicts in the workplace and found ways to effectively voice and act, sure, some of them were quite assertive, aggressive, risk takers, but some of them were actually people who were much more cautious and conservative, even fearful. And one woman, an investment banker who told me a story, said the reason she acted on her values was because she was a timid person, and it seemed the safer route. And so part of what I realized is that we need to actually not just focus on figuring out what's right and then preaching moral courage. I call that the preach and pretend method. Preach about what's right and pretend you can do it. Instead of doing that we actually needed to give people the opportunity to learn from people who had raised these issues effectively and to literally rehearse and practice and get more comfortable with speaking about these issues, to build that kind of habit. And so that's really what I did. I mean, I want to respond to what Kurt was saying about, having culture specific examples. What's been so gratifying to me about doing this work, I mean, I don't have the answer to how to act ethically in every situation, but what's so gratifying is that when I ask this question, examples come forward. So for example, right now I'm working with some faculty in Ghana at Ashesi University who are creating a sort of Pan-African Giving Voice to Values educational experience. And they've been generating cases by interviewing people in the public service sector, in business, in academic sector, in Africa, who have confronted systemic challenges as well as interpersonal kinds of ethical challenges, and yet have found effective ways to act. And that's what always is so encouraging to me. And, we talk about moral courage, and of course that's a good thing. I'm all in favor of it, but I think it's a pretty high bar. And so what I'm trying to do is to actually also build people's moral competence through this rehearsal and practice, so that they don't always require that same Herculean level of moral courage. Obviously sometimes it's necessary, but can't we create a different kind of conversation in our organizations, which is actually also another way to address some of the challenges that Kurt was describing, because you normalize this kind of conversation and you make people more comfortable with having this conversation. A lot of the companies I work with are, like government contractors, et cetera, who have really strict regulations about having to report, malpractice. And so they get nervous when they hear about giving voice to values, because they feel like, does this mean we're going to cover up issues? And what I try and explain to them is, no, what this is about is trying to intervene before the situation happens. I remember doing some work with Lockheed Martin, the defense contractor in the US, and they were looking at the impact of using GVV over the years. And one of the things that they thought they were seeing from their data gathering was that not only were people raising issues more often, but they were coming to their ethics and compliance officers and saying, I see us going down a path that may become problematic. I want to intervene. They weren't reporting for investigation. They would say, I want to intervene before it gets to that point, before we're required to do that. Will you help me create an effective strategy and action plan and script? And from Lockheed's perspective, this was more true culture change, because it wasn't simply a matter of me going to the ethics officer and dumping the problem in their lap and saying, you take care of it. It was, I want to be empowered to have this conversation, to raise these issues. I'm doing the same thing right now with KPMG, the accounting and consulting firm, and we're identifying the kinds of issues that they feel they might encounter And then we're developing a whole cadre of, master facilitators who can lead these kinds of giving voice to values type conversations within the organization to normalize the conversation. So long way of saying moral courage is great, but let's actually focus on building moral competence, building this moral muscle memory, this habit and comfort level with speaking about these issues constructively.
So what
two
please,
things on that. Yeah, I'd just like to add two things to what Mary said. I agree with her, firstly about the courage, but then the kind of proactive role. I think it was Charles Taylor who said, moral courage grows with usage. Physical courage deteriorates with usage. The more we physically show up, you can think of a rugby game or American football game. Every time we run at our competition, we become physically weaker. So physical courage degrades with use, but moral courage, the first time I speak up about something small, I'm nervous, I'm shaking, there's tension. The second time's easier, the third time, but the 10th time, it's part of who I am. And so Mary, I think, rightly talks to this idea of encouraging people to tell and emulate the stories of those who have taken courageous stands. I think that's quite important. I mean, we move away from what's known as sort of habitual sense making, where we base what we're doing on habit or how things used to be done, kind of old mental models. It's a kind of a respond to change as a threat, where you do it afterwards, or you have what organizations do is there is an issue that comes up. And so then they have a kind of episodic moment where they have ethical engagement and then drop back down to their kind of habitual practice after that. And I think what Mary's raised quite rightly, and we should make a lot more noise about this around the world, is how do we engage kind of morally imaginative sense making, this notion of getting involved in a proactive way, proactive engagement to meet this change in ethical expectations. We see in South Africa, for instance, if we look at our top 5 banks, just as an example to make it practical, you can imagine managers and leaders sitting around and saying, we've captured 86% of the market, we're doing fine, we're making good profits. Is there any need to change? Now that kind of moral imaginative engagement would say, but what are we hearing from the public? Let's talk to people on the ground. And people are saying stuff like, my fees is too high. I can't pay X amount of money every month. When I go to the ATM, it costs too much to withdraw money. But the banks sat on this knowledge, didn't change because it made financial and bottom line sense. So what happens? It opened the door for disruptors to step in. In South Africa's case, Capitec moved in, came with no to very low fees, and so on. Now our big banks are responding. It's a reactive, ethical, kind of, I call it episodic ethical engagement, because they had to react because they were bleeding market share because of having sat on knowledge for a long time. So I would say, as Mary says, how do we do the proactive stuff, right? By engaging stakeholders, knowing where their pain points are, knowing what's not working for them, where they are at, and trying to solve those issues. I mean, in other spaces, they will call this social enterprise or social innovation. How do businesses, not as an aside, but as their core business, act proactively to allow people to come forward to engage with the ills in society in proactive ways? And that might require us building up the capability of individuals to speak up ethically, to engage with courage some issues and so on. Otherwise, we're always going to react.
So Eddy, could speak about the banks, and you were quite deeply involved in the bank, the commercial bank of Mauritius.
Yes.
What he is saying is that profit is not just a number. Encapsulated in that number, because this is sometimes, I think, the distinction that we get is this money versus wallet conversation. Profit is not just a number. A profit declaration actually encapsulates all the underlying process, the conversations, the value systems, the application of ethics and so on. Would you agree with that? And how should a business interrogate actually its own performance from a values and ethics perspective?
No, absolutely. I completely agree with Kurt, and I connect to what he said in terms of reactive initiatives whilst we sit on relevant data. It's absolutely correct. But I have had the chance to work for a bank which was more proactive on that front, and probably is the leader in terms of listening to customers' concerns and act on them. But I'd like to go back to for just two practical points, going back to what Mary talked about. She mentioned the cultural, the culture as organizational culture, where that would get people to adhere to what values have been defined, and how to then operationalize those values. That's what, in the end, I call the reflex. More than behavior, it has to become a reflex. But to do that, we have to deep dive. We can't just stay on the surface and accept those definitions and those values that have now become superficial. We really need to deep dive. There was mention of whistleblowing. Another practical point about whistleblowing. I was in an organization where they put in place a whistleblowing policy and process. The only thing is that the whistleblower, if ever there is something to report, he would have to go to the compliance department, which is within the organization. And of course, nobody will go there, because you're talking to a colleague and you're talking to someone who is within the organization. And if you want to be credible, and that's what a couple of organizations have done, which I know of, is to get a third party to manage those unethical reports and behavior. There's one organization in Mauritius that used Transparency Mauritius, which is a branch of Transparency International, to do that job for them. So it's like you outsource, the whistleblowing process to a third party outside the organization, where you now build credibility, and your message is, we are serious about it.
Thank you. I want to go to the Q&A, because I realize that you might suspect us of neglecting you there. Laura, before I go there, I'm making a personal undertaking that if you harvest for us all the questions from the Q&A, that I will take care that and to the extent that I need the help, the panelists will respond to that, put that into a document, and you can then circulate it back to those who wanted to attend, and those on the call as well, so that we do not push you into suffering that sense of neglect. But there is one question that I think is a short one that I quickly would like to pick up before I want to push our conversation in a different direction. Will the use of accountability conversations to encourage ethical behavior be a step in the right direction in an organization? And that was asked by Elsabe Okam. Elsabe, I think the question is quite straightforward. If you want to say something about it, you're welcome. Otherwise, I'd like the panel to respond. The use of accountability conversations to encourage ethical behavior, would that be a step in the right direction?
Arnold, I'll touch on that, and I think it answers two questions. those accountability conversation, and I see Precious asked the question of whether boards have oversight over company adverts. And I think I can answer both of those from my perspective. I am a true believer in the power of narrative. I think the more we can have these kinds of conversations, it sets the tone of what is acceptable in the organization. I mean, we've got really good examples in South Africa where the conversations were not had in the organizations, and the tone for what is ethical and what is right hasn't permeated the whole organization, so that we got to a point where clicks allowed a Tresemme ad that caused a huge fracas in our country. And it had implications on, on their market share. They lost many, many customers because, a Tresemme ad put a large group of South African society in a negative light through the ad. Now, does the clicks board sit around and go through what ads we put in out? I don't think so. But there is a marketing director who at some point had to cascade down the notion of what is acceptable and what we stand for in organization. That's why I think these accountability conversations are important. We just saw Alan Amber, the chairman of Spur, Mary, one of our steak ranch outlets, is listed on the stock exchange. He just launched his book this week. And in his book, he explains how he once was notified of something going on with a franchisee division where something happened and there was a big fracas and many people decided not to go to the Spur and they took sides. He only responded because it came to him through social media. So he was not in that comment. So again, he writes about, how does he, as an individual, as the head of the organization, get that message lower and lower down, even when you got franchisees? How do you get the message across your organization of what you stand for? And I think this is where these accountability conversations coming, or giving voice to values, as Mary puts it. I think the use of regular dialogue sessions where you unpack issues, where people talk about, for me, often the challenge with ethics is whether it's religion or philosophy or corporate value statements that tells us what's right and what's wrong. 98% of people probably do the right thing versus the wrong thing. There'll always be the 2% who choose to engage and cross the line. But that's not the challenge for the 98%. The challenge, as Joseph Badaraka, who is one of Mary's colleagues at Harvard, he writes about, when things become gray areas, when you must choose between a smaller wrong over a bigger wrong, or a bigger right over a smaller right. This is where most people have trouble with. And that's where our philosophies and our religion don't help so much, because it's not this or that, black or white, right or wrong. It's actually a mix of the two. And this is where these accountability conversations, or the giving voice to values dialogue sessions, can make a real difference, because if people talk about the gray areas and what they did in the gray areas, as well as the challenges they had in those gray areas, when they didn't know what they were going to do next, or when they cried at night trying to make sense of these tensions. I think this is why these conversations, or as our writer writes, accountability conversations, I think needs to be introduced in organizations as a regular given, Arnold. That's my view on it.
Mary,
can I jump in there for a minute?
Yes,
Arnold?
please.
Okay. I just wanted to comment on what Kurt was saying about gray issues versus more clear-cut issues. When I first started teaching in MBA programs, graduate business programs around ethics, that was always what we would say. In fact, I remember having this conversation with Joe. Kurt was talking about Joe Baracco. And of course, there are a lot of gray issues, and those are very challenging. And I don't know what the right answer is to all those situations. But the thing is, those are typically issues where reasonable people of goodwill could legitimately disagree. That's why they're gray. And so we used to say, so don't focus on the clear-cut issues, only focus on the gray issues. That's where the rubber hits the road. I actually have changed my mind about that. It's not that I don't think it's useful to have the conversation Kurt's describing, I do, so that we can hone our ability to think rigorously and consistently about those gray issues. But I actually think that a bigger challenge is that there are a lot of issues where most of us, the 98% that Kurt's talking about, most of us would agree that's the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do, but we don't necessarily believe it's possible, feasible to do it in the organizations where we work because of various kinds of pressures, whether it's from our manager or our investors, et cetera. And so my approach is to actually try and help people to be more effective, more confident, more likely to speak in successful ways and to act in successful ways to address those more clear-cut infractions. I think what happens is when you do that, first of all, you've addressed a lot of the most egregious issues because some of the most egregious violations are more clear-cut, but also you get better at talking about the gray issues because you've changed the nature of the conversation within the organization. And the last thing I'll say about that is I remember a number of years ago working with the US Army around these issues. And I was working with a guy who was responsible for developing training for the 1.3 million enlisted and civilians in the Army around ethics and professionalism. And, one of the things he said to me was, when I started doing this work a number of years ago, it seemed that there were a lot of issues that were clear-cut, right, wrong issues. And the longer I've worked in this, the more people are identifying issues as gray. And one of the things we were talking about is when you don't believe it's possible to act effectively, what we tend to do is see the issue as gray. It's not because we decide to obfuscate. It's not because we're trying to just rationalize. It's automatic. It's unconscious. It's because we don't want to live in that place of cognitive dissonance that Kurt was talking about, where you know something's wrong and you do it anyway. And so there's this process of seeing more things as gray when we don't believe we have the capability to act. And so that's why from a developmental model, which is I think where you wanted to go with the conversation, Arnold, I think it's actually important to focus on those issues where we know what's right. We just don't know how to do it effectively.
So I think you have felt where I want to go, specifically maybe around, and Kurt, it's coming also from what you have said. I think we are quite good at having good postmortems, for instance, about companies in the news, about what went wrong. And then we often say, but couldn't they foresee it? I mean, how is it possible? So I want to take the last few minutes of our conversation and ask the question, how do we develop an ethical mindset? How do we help people to become aware and mindful of the consequences of decisions and actions, seeing them, anticipating them? And with this, I do not only, I'm going to push you a little bit from a personal perspective, not only just want an academic answer to the question. How do you go about keeping ethically fit and alert, mindful? I mean, what disciplines are there to master? What things are there that people can practically do in order to move themselves over and above what we have already shared? Dialogue, looking for good mentors, and so forth. But from a more personal perspective, because I think there is also a link nowadays between ethical awareness and neuroscience and the kind of exercises that go with meditation, reflection, and so on. Maybe you want to comment on that. Who would like to start?
Well, since I am not the academic here, so I can just step in and talk about things that are not necessarily academic. How do you then get an ethical mindset? A few things in our toolbox, like defining and aligning our values. And I completely agree with Mary on that point. We have to define, we have to voice, and the narrative that Kurt talked about, we probably need to push that. And there's one thing I wanted to talk about earlier is promoting open communication. But with each decision leaders make, they've got to be transparent and encourage feedback from the team. It would help those in your team to feel more confident to share ideas and to share especially concerns. And the good old lead by example, I think, remains extremely relevant in the space of ethics. For me, if you want to build an ethical company, that's what we all want to do. You have to start from the top down. Employees, your team members, they see your behavior, your choices, your values, and hopefully they will adopt them in their own practices. So that's what I would suggest from a very sort of grounded and practical point.
Thank you, Eddy. I'm going to go to Mary and then to Kurt, and then there's one person. Get ready so long. Michael T, you have raised your hand. I didn't see that, but I've been told about that. And if you want to pose your question, you would be welcome. But Mary, and then Kurt, and then I'll go to Mike.
Sure,
then we need to close.
Thanks. I agree with Eddy on the importance of example, especially from folks who are more senior in the organization, but also people at your own level who are finding ways to voice and act on your values. In terms of the question that Arnold mentioned, though, about what are some of the individual practices that we can do in terms of self-reflection and awareness and developing our own competence to do this. And there's lots of things, but one of the things that I find most useful, I use it myself, I'm with myself, and I also use it with organizations, is something, it's something I call the tale of two stories, but I actually, which gets back to the conversation about the power of narrative, but where I actually try and ask people to reflect on what are some times when I've encountered a values conflict and I have successfully been able to act and voice on my values, and what enabled me to do that? What made it harder? How did I get over the disablers? What was the motivation? How do I feel about it? And then to think about times when we have not been able to do so effectively, and why that was. What was different about those? What were the enablers or the disablers? If I were in that situation again, how might I act? And the point of doing that is that you actually understand that, first of all, we all are capable of effectively acting on our values. We've all done it at some point in some context. It may not always be at work, but we're all capable of that. We've also all failed to do it at other points, so there's a kind of honesty in it, a kind of humility in it, a kind of learning mindset in it, to understand that this is not easy. It's not even always going to be successful, but it's important and we can get better at it. And we can learn how to get better at it by looking at these examples and looking at the enablers and disablers. If we're in a leadership position, we want to minimize the disablers in our organizational context. We want to maximize the enablers. And if we're not in a leadership position, we still want to understand what's true for me in terms of enablers and disablers. Some of them are common to all of us. I mean, none of us really enjoy it when we have a manager or a boss who kills the messenger. But on the other hand, some things are going to be unique to our individual styles, personality, capabilities, competencies. As I was talking earlier, if you're an introvert or an extrovert, if you're a risk taker or risk averse, and knowing that about yourself helps you to understand how to play to your strengths when you're dealing with these issues. So I encourage that little mental exercise.
Thank you, Mary. Kurt, before you speak and address this question, I also want you then to pick up on Michael's question, because I think the question belongs to the same conversation, which is about closing the gap between conversation and action. I think it somehow fits this, and if you can respond to that combined with your last input, Kurt, I would appreciate it.
Yeah. I mean, just directly to Michael's question, there are companies now who are finding, because of great AI and software these days, we can actually set up sort of values and the behaviors we'd like to see in organizations, and we can incentivize it, right? So we can get people through the way we engage social media now. When someone acts in a way that we like or that the organization wants to see, we can give likes and thumbs ups and trophies and whatever the case may be, and even write little letters and so on. There is software these days to do that. You can also then, as an organization, give managers in your organization budgets to both physically with money, incentivize people who's lived your values in the organization this week, this month, this quarter, to go and buy a TV, take their family to a hotel or a restaurant, or some intangible things, help sponsor them to study something, or to get involved in Habitat for Humanity, and so and as a company you put some money towards that. So there are ways companies are finding ways to bring intentioned values to actual behaviors. In South Africa, one of the more popular software systems is Bounty XP. I mean, they literally are working with large corporates to do exactly that. To talk about what Mary said, I think, knowing yourself, when Mary spoke about this decision, knowing yourself, and that comes down to knowing what are your values. I mean, what do you stand for? And I think importantly for people to understand, what are the values that are set in stone for you? You're not movable on them. And what are those values that are malleable? You're willing to move 5-10% either way of those. So you might value family as one of your top 3, but sometimes you need to work a little bit late. You're okay to push that a bit, but not all the time, and so on. But I think everybody needs to really determine what their values are. I think that's quite important. And then to surround yourself with people who live the values you're talking about. Even finding role models that kind of live the values that you want to be seen in an organization. I always find it's very easy to demand when you're sitting in, when you have the ability to control people, you have military might, economic might, or you're the director, the CFO, the CEO, the position of your authority, or you've got economic muscle. It's easy to make other people do what you want. It doesn't always have great impact on who they are, but you can make them. My experience is that the people who really encourage other people to want the same things you do, which for me is really the kind of ethics we're talking about, is when people act from acts of generosity. There's an appeal to cultural, social, moral messages. There's a respect for other traditions. We use attraction and influence. And in fact, as I started by saying, this ethics of care and justice, acting from deep care, in fact, acting from love as a way to draw other people in terms of how to behave and how to act. For me, those things seem, when I often ask people, name me some leaders you admire, they almost never say someone who can solve a triple integral, who can do a multivariate structural analysis, or someone who can write a great marketing plan or develop IT middleware infrastructure. These things never come up. They always talk about people who are generous, people who are empathetic, people who show compassion, and so on. And so I think we need to shift our focus towards a type of leadership that embraces this kind of deep care, deep love, respect for others, attraction and influence. That seems to be the people we most admire, and we're drawn to how they behave. And I go back to Eddy's notion of being a role model and also turning to role models in this way. Thanks, Arnold.
I think that's a fantastic note to end on. We unfortunately have to call the end of this conversation. It was enjoyable, fascinating. I think there are lots of things that we could still further pursue. The promise that we will respond to unanswered questions, that promise is real, at least from my side, but you will have to wait until I come back from my leave in Namibia, which is about 2 weeks from now. I want to thank Mary and Kurt and Eddy for a most enjoyable conversation. Thank you for your time, your sacrifice in that sense. And I hope that for everybody present, it was an enriching and empowering experience. Laura, for you and your team, thank you so much. It's over to you.
Thank you, Arnold. Actually, if you wouldn't mind popping those last slides on for us. Thank you so much. This has been such an insightful session. Just to be able to spend time with such great minds like you. And I have, just to reassure everybody, I'm going to give Arnold a quick opportunity to share this with you. But before I do that, I have copied over the questions that were popped in the Q&A, and I will be sharing them with Arnold. And yes, there will be a recording. So we have recorded this session and we will be uploading it to our YouTube channel. And we will send everybody an email out with the link as soon as that is up. Arnold is going to be presenting at another conference, and we just wanted to quickly, Arnold, can you just mention a bit about that conference before we say goodbye?
Yeah, thank you, Laura. This is not me presenting at another conference. This is me arranging another conference for 3 days in March from 16 to 18 as a great collaboration between USB, UCT, the Albert Luthuli Center in Pretoria, and the Globally Responsible Leadership Initiative. It's a conference on responsible leadership reimagined. You will find the information right there. Laura, for those people who might be interested in either doing a practitioner or an academic or scholarly proposal, you can maybe just copy the link in the chat and follow the instructions from there. You might find at this stage that the deadline for abstracts is still being published as the end of October. We've extended that. That's the good news. So I hope that this will kindle your interest and that we might be seeing you at the conference next year. Once again, from my side, thank you very much.
Thanks, Arnold. And then we can just move it over to the final slide. We've, just to let you know, that we've had over 750 people register for this series. And this wraps up the Conscious Leadership series. So we look forward to hosting you all back again in 2022. We've actually had the opportunity of presenting some of these as workshops to our clients. So if that is something that might interest you, if you would like us to present something like this format to your organization, please get in touch with us. Our contact details are on the screen at the moment, and we can see what we can organize for you wherever you are situated in the world. That's the beauty of this technology. It brings us all together. So that brings us to the end of this webinar. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Laura.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you to the panel again.
Arnold.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Stay safe.
Bye-bye.
Bye.